It began with a single decision, one choice, one moment, and nothing that came after it was ever the same. The world in 1945 was a world that had been burning for a very long time, not in one place, not in one country, everywhere, across oceans and mountains and cities and fields. The fire of war had been spreading for years. Millions of people were already dead. Whole cities had been turned to rubble. Entire generations of young men had been sent into the fighting and never come back. Mothers waited at doors that never opened again. Children grew up not knowing what peace felt like. The world was tired in a way that is very hard to describe. It was the kind of tired that goes all the way down into the bones of a civilization. And still, the war did not end. America had entered this war in December of 1941. On a quiet Sunday morning, without any warning, the Japanese military sent hundreds of aircraft to attack the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were killed. Ships were sunk. Planes were destroyed on the ground before they could even get into the air. The attack was sudden and devastating. It pulled the United States fully and completely into a war that was already consuming the rest of the world. From that morning forward, America was at war, and the country would not stop fighting until the war was finished. American soldiers went to fight in the deserts of North Africa. They climbed through the mountains of Italy under constant fire. They landed on the beaches of Normandy in France on a day that would be remembered forever, stepping out of boats into cold water and gunfire, moving forward even as the men beside them fell. They fought through snow and frozen forests in Belgium during one of the worst winters Europe had seen in years. They crossed rivers and captured bridges and died in small towns that most of them had never heard of before the war sent them there. They were young men from farms and cities and small towns all across America. They were far from home, and they fought with everything they had. But it was a war in the Pacific that had become something particularly dark and difficult. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military had moved quickly across the Pacific Ocean and into Southeast Asia. They had taken territory after territory. Island after island had fallen under their control. And now, as the years of war dragged on, the American military was fighting to take those islands back, one by one, each one more brutal than the last. The battles had names that became famous and terrible at the same time. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each of these places was a small piece of land surrounded by ocean, but each of them cost an enormous price in human life. The Japanese military had a way of fighting that the American commanders had not fully expected. They did not give up. They did not fall back when they were outnumbered. They fought to the very last man. They chose death over surrender. It was part of a code of honor that ran very deep in Japanese military culture, and it made every island battle a nightmare. At Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 Americans were killed. At Okinawa, the number was even higher. And with every island that was taken, the Japanese mainland was getting closer. The American military began planning for the invasion of Japan itself. The plan was called Operation Downfall. The estimates for what this invasion would cost were almost too large to understand. Military planners believed that hundreds of thousands of American soldiers could be killed or wounded in the fighting. Some estimates went even higher, and the Japanese would suffer losses many times greater. The Japanese government was already organizing ordinary citizens, including women and children, to resist the invasion with whatever weapons they could find. The word they used was ketsugo. It meant decisive operation. They were preparing to defend every inch of their homeland. The invasion, if it happened, would likely be the bloodiest single military operation in all of human history. This was a situation that President Harry S. Truman inherited when Franklin D. Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945. Truman had been vice president for only 82 days. He had not been told about the Manhattan Project. He had not been told about the atomic bomb. He had not been told about the secret work being done in the desert of New Mexico. On the day he took the oath of office and became the 33rd President of the United States, he had no idea that the most consequential decision in modern history was already being placed into his hands. Truman was a plain man from Missouri. He did not come from wealth or privilege. He had grown up on a farm. He had fought in the First World War as an artillery officer. He was direct, practical, and blunt in the way he spoke and thought. He did not pretend to be something he was not. And now, in the spring of 1945, he was the most powerful man in the world, suddenly responsible for ending a war that had already killed tens of millions of people, with a weapon that no one outside a very small circle even knew existed. Secretary of War Henry Stimson came to Truman shortly after he became president. He told him about the Manhattan Project. He told him about the bomb. He told him that within a few months, the United States would have a weapon of almost unimaginable destructive power, a weapon that could level an entire city, a weapon that had never existed before in human history. Truman listened, and the weight of what he was hearing settled over him like something very heavy and very permanent. The Manhattan Project had begun in total secrecy back in 1942. Its roots went even further back than that, to a letter written in 1939 by the physicist Albert Einstein and his colleague Leo Szilard, addressed directly to President Roosevelt. The letter warned that recent advances in nuclear physics made it possible that an extremely powerful new type of bomb could be built. It warned further that scientists in Germany might already be working toward that goal. If Adolf Hitler's regime developed an atomic bomb before America did, the consequences for the world were too terrible to imagine. Roosevelt understood the urgency. He authorized the project, and the work began. The scientists who gathered to do this work came from many different countries. Many of them were Europeans who had fled the darkness spreading across their home countries. Enrico Fermi had come from Italy. Leo Szilard had come from Hungary. Niels Bohr had come from Denmark. Edward Teller had come from Hungary as well. Klaus Fuchs had come from Germany. Many of them were Jewish. Many of them had family members who had been trapped or killed in the growing horror of the Holocaust. They came to America and brought with them some of the finest scientific minds the world had ever produced. And they were all pointed toward a single goal: build the bomb before anyone else does. The man chosen to lead the scientific side of the project was Robert Oppenheimer. He was American-born, from New York City. He was thin and intense, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to be always thinking about something a little beyond the ordinary world. He smoked constantly. He could read Sanskrit. He loved poetry. He was one of the most brilliant theoretical physicists of his generation, and he had a gift not just for science, but for leading scientists, for gathering brilliant and difficult and highly independent people and somehow pointing them all in the same direction. Oppenheimer had political views in his past that had made some people in the government nervous. He had associated with people who had communist sympathies during the 1930s. The security services watched him carefully, but the project needed him. There was arguably no one else who could do what he did, and so he was given the job. He was given a laboratory in the desert, and he was told to build something that had never been built before. The laboratory was at Los Alamos, New Mexico. It sat on a high plateau surrounded by desert and mountains. It was remote and isolated. That was intentional. The work being done there was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the history of the United States. The people who worked there were not allowed to tell their families what they were doing. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. The address used on official documents was simply a post office box number in Santa Fe. The place barely existed officially. But inside those fences, some of the most extraordinary scientific work in human history was being done every single day. The basic science that made the bomb possible was a discovery called nuclear fission. Scientists have found that if you bombarded the nucleus of certain heavy atoms, particularly uranium and plutonium, with neutrons, the nucleus would split apart. When it split, it released an enormous amount of energy. And it also released more neutrons, which could then split more atoms, which released more energy and more neutrons, in a chain reaction that could grow with almost unimaginable speed. If you could control that reaction carefully and slowly, you could generate power. But if you let it happen all at once, uncontrolled, in a single fraction of a second, you got an explosion unlike anything the world had ever seen. The scientists at Los Alamos worked on this problem from every angle. They studied the physics. They designed the mechanisms. They calculated the precise amounts of material needed to make the reaction work. They tested components separately. They argued and debated and worked through the night. Two different designs emerged. One used uranium. One used plutonium. Each design worked differently. Each had to be tested, refined, and perfected. The work was painstaking, detailed, sometimes frustrating, sometimes exhilarating. These were men and women who were doing something that had never been done before. They were walking into territory where no human being had ever walked, and they knew it. The general overseeing the entire military side of the Manhattan Project was Leslie Groves. He was large, blunt, demanding, and extremely effective. He had overseen the construction of the Pentagon building just a few years earlier, completing it ahead of schedule. He ran the Manhattan Project the same way he ran everything else, with relentless focus and very little patience for delay or excuses. He and Oppenheimer made an unusual pair, the military man and the poet-scientist. But somehow, between the two of them, they kept the project moving forward. They kept the secret, and they built the bomb. By the spring of 1945, the work was nearly complete. Germany had already been defeated. The threat that had originally driven the project, the fear that Hitler might get the bomb first, was gone. Some of the scientists began to question what they were doing. Some of them wrote letters and petitions arguing that the bomb should not be used against Japan without some kind of warning or demonstration first. They had built this thing. They understood what it could do better than anyone, and some of them were frightened by what they had created. One group of scientists, led in part by Leo Szilard, the same man who had helped write the original letter to Roosevelt, circulated a petition arguing that Japan should be given a clear warning before any atomic bomb was dropped on a city. They argued that the United States had a moral responsibility to give Japan the chance to surrender before unleashing this new and terrible weapon on a civilian population. The petition gathered dozens of signatures. It was sent up through official channels. It never reached Truman. It was classified and set aside. The decision-making process had already moved past the point where a petition from scientists was going to change its direction. The test came on July 16, 1945. In a remote section of the New Mexico desert, in a place called Jornada del Muerto, which is a Spanish phrase meaning the journey of the dead man, the world's first atomic bomb was detonated. The scientists called this test Trinity. No one is entirely certain why Oppenheimer chose that name. He said later it came from a poem by John Donne. But the name itself carried something of the weight of the moment, something sacred and something terrible at the same time. The bomb was placed on top of a 100-foot steel tower in the desert. At exactly 5:29 in the morning, before the sun had fully risen, the device was triggered. What happened next was something that no person standing there had truly been prepared for, even though they had all spent years working toward this exact moment. The light came first, a flash of white light so intense and so sudden that it was visible for hundreds of miles in every direction. People sleeping in towns far away saw the sky light up as if the sun had suddenly appeared at the wrong time in the wrong place. Windows rattled. Some people thought an ammunition dump had exploded somewhere. Some people thought something had gone wrong with the world. Then came the heat. Even at distances of several miles from the explosion, observers felt a wave of heat wash over them like opening the door of a furnace. The temperature at the center of the explosion was estimated to be hotter than the surface of the sun. The desert sand beneath the tower was fused into a glassy substance that scientists would later call trinitite, green and glassy and permanent, a scar left on the earth by something that had never touched the earth before. Then the tower itself was simply gone. Not damaged, not knocked over. Gone, vaporized, turned into nothing in a fraction of a second. And then the cloud. The cloud rose up from the desert floor in a great column of fire and smoke and debris, climbing higher and higher into the morning sky. It flattened at the top into a shape that no one who saw it ever forgot, a shape that would become the defining image of a new and terrifying age. The mushroom cloud, rising above the desert, visible for miles in every direction, a sign that something had changed in the world, something that could not be changed back. Oppenheimer watched from a distance of about 5 miles. He later described what went through his mind as he watched the cloud rise. He said a line from ancient Hindu scripture came to him in that moment. The line said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He did not say this with pride. He said it with the way of a man who had just understood fully and finally what he had done. General Groves was also watching. His reaction was different. He later wrote that his first thought was relief that the thing had actually worked. His second thought was about the end of the war. He believed that what he had just seen would end the war quickly. He believed it with great certainty. And, in a sense, he was right. The news was sent immediately to President Truman, who was in Potsdam, Germany at the time, attending a conference with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Truman received a message and later wrote in his diary that it was the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. He did not use those words with celebration. He used them with the quiet understanding that the world had just moved into a new kind of danger, a new kind of possibility, a new era that no one was fully prepared for. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allied leaders issued a declaration to Japan. It warned Japan to surrender immediately or face prompt and utter destruction. It did not mention the atomic bomb by name. It did not describe what prompt and utter destruction would actually look like. The Japanese government did not fully understand what they were being threatened with. Their response was to reject the ultimatum and continue fighting. The Japanese military was still in control of significant decision-making power, and the military was not prepared to accept surrender. The decision to use the bomb was not made in a single moment by a single person. It developed over weeks and months through a process that involved military commanders, political advisors, and the president himself. A special committee was formed to advise Truman on the question. It was called the Interim Committee. It included some of the most powerful men in the American government, as well as key scientific advisors, including Oppenheimer himself. The committee met and discussed and deliberated. They considered different options. They asked hard questions. And ultimately, they recommended that the bomb should be used against Japan as soon as it was ready, without prior warning. The reasoning behind this recommendation was complex and layered. First, there was the question of ending the war as quickly as possible. Every week the war continued. More people died. American soldiers died. Japanese soldiers died. Japanese civilians died. The bombing campaigns over Japan were already causing enormous destruction and loss of life. The firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945 had killed more people in a single night than the atomic bomb would kill at Hiroshima. The war was already consuming lives on a massive scale. The bomb, terrible as it was, might end that consumption quickly. Second, there was the question of the planned invasion. Operation Downfall was still being prepared. The military planners were still training soldiers and gathering ships and preparing for what they believed could be the most costly military operation in history. If the bomb could make that invasion unnecessary, it would save hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives as well. This argument carried enormous weight with Truman. He was a man who had fought in a war himself. He knew what it meant to send men into combat. He was not willing to order an invasion if there was another way. Third, there was the political reality of the Soviet Union. Stalin's forces had agreed to enter the war against Japan after Germany was defeated. They were about to do so. If the war ended quickly, before the Soviet Union could establish a major military presence in Asia, it would limit Soviet influence in the post-war settlement of the Pacific. The atomic bomb was not just a military weapon. It was a political instrument. It sent a message about American power that would shape the entire post-war world. The target cities were chosen carefully. The committee wanted cities that had not yet been heavily damaged by conventional bombing, so that the full effect of the atomic bomb could be clearly measured and understood. They wanted cities of significant military and industrial importance, and they wanted cities large enough that the impact would be undeniable. Several cities were put on the list. Hiroshima was at the top. It was a major military headquarters and a port city of considerable size. Nagasaki was also on the list. So were several others. One notable decision was made in this process. Secretary of War Stimson personally intervened to remove the ancient city of Kyoto from the target list. Kyoto was Japan's ancient cultural capital, filled with temples and shrines and irreplaceable historical treasures. Stimson had visited Kyoto before the war and had great respect for its cultural significance. He argued, successfully, that destroying Kyoto would create a bitterness among the Japanese people that would last for generations and make any lasting peace more difficult to achieve. Kyoto was removed from the list. Nagasaki, which had been a secondary choice, moved up. On August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay, after the mother of its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, flew over the city of Hiroshima, Japan. The plane was carrying a single bomb. The bomb was nicknamed Little Boy. It weighed about 9,000 pounds. At 8:15 in the morning local time, the bomb was released. 43 seconds later, at an altitude of about 1,900 feet above the center of the city, the bomb detonated. What happened to Hiroshima in the moments that followed is almost impossible to describe in words. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional explosive. The temperature at the center of the blast reached several thousand degrees. Everything within a radius of about a mile of the detonation point was either vaporized or set on fire instantly. Buildings collapsed. The entire center of the city was leveled in seconds. A great wave of pressure moved outward from the explosion, destroying everything in its path. Fire spread rapidly through the city. People who were close to the center of the explosion simply ceased to exist. They left behind only shadows burned into stone and concrete by the intense flash of light. People who were farther away were badly burned, some of them beyond recognition. People who appeared physically unharmed in the first moments would, in the days and weeks that followed, develop symptoms of radiation sickness that were not yet understood by medical science. They would lose their hair. They would bleed internally. Their immune systems would fail. They would die in ways that doctors had never seen before and did not know how to treat. The city of Hiroshima, which had been a functioning city of roughly 350,000 people that morning, was destroyed. Estimates of the immediate death toll range from 70,000 to 80,000 people killed outright in the initial explosion and its immediate aftermath. Tens of thousands more would die in the weeks and months that followed from burns, injuries, and the effects of radiation. The total death toll at Hiroshima is generally estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and 140,000 people. Most of them were civilians. Many of them were women, children, and elderly people, because so many of the city's young men were away fighting in the military. The Enola Gay flew away from the city after releasing the bomb. The crew looked back and saw the mushroom cloud rising over where Hiroshima had been. Colonel Tibbets later said that he had no regrets. He believed the bomb ended the war and saved lives. The rest of the crew had more complicated feelings. Some of them carried what they had seen and done for the rest of their lives. Some of them had nightmares. Some of them spoke about it openly. Some of them never spoke about it at all. In Washington, President Truman was on a ship, the USS Augusta, returning from the Potsdam Conference, when the news reached him. He was in the officers' mess, having lunch with members of the crew, when an aide brought him a message confirming that the bomb had been dropped and that it had worked. Truman later described his feeling as one of enormous relief, mixed with a clear understanding of the gravity of what had just happened. He told the men around him that the most terrible weapon in the history of the world had just been used. He was not boasting. He was stating a fact that he was still absorbing. A formal statement was released in Truman's name. It announced that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. It described the bomb as a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. It warned Japan that if they did not accept the terms of surrender immediately, they could expect a rain of ruin from the air the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The words were chosen carefully. They were meant to shock. They were meant to persuade the Japanese government to surrender. They were meant to prevent the need for a second bomb. But Japan did not surrender immediately. The Japanese government and military leadership were in a state of shock and confusion. They knew something catastrophic had happened at Hiroshima, but the communications from the city were destroyed along with almost everything else. They did not immediately have a full picture of what had happened. Some military commanders refused to believe that a single bomb could destroy an entire city. They suggested it might have been a massive conventional bombing raid. They argued for continuing to fight. The internal debate within the Japanese government was intense and painful and deeply divided. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was dropped. The primary target that day was the city of Kokura. But when the 29 named Boxcar reached Kokura. The city was covered by clouds and smoke from fires burning in a nearby city that had been bombed the previous day. The crew circled and waited. They could not drop the bomb without a visual target. Time and fuel were running short. The decision was made to move to the secondary target. The secondary target was Nagasaki. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki was different from the one dropped on Hiroshima. The Hiroshima bomb had used uranium. The Nagasaki bomb used plutonium. It was nicknamed Fat Man. It was actually a more powerful bomb than the one dropped on Hiroshima. But Nagasaki's geography, the city sat in a valley surrounded by hills, contained some of the blast effects. The destruction was nevertheless enormous. Between 40,000 and 80,000 people were killed. A significant portion of the city was destroyed. The suffering that followed was the same kind of terrible, lingering suffering that the people of Hiroshima had already begun to endure. Among the dead at Nagasaki were thousands of Korean forced laborers who had been brought to Japan to work in the city's factories. There were also a number of Allied prisoners of war being held in the area. The bomb did not distinguish between Japanese soldiers and civilians, between Japanese nationals and foreign workers, between enemies and captives. It destroyed everything and everyone within its reach. That was what it was designed to do. That was what it did. The shock of 2 atomic bombs in 3 days, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan and the rapid advance of Soviet forces in Manchuria, finally broke the deadlock within the Japanese government. Emperor Hirohito himself intervened in the debate among his advisors in a way that was extraordinary and unprecedented. The emperor, who was traditionally a figure above the political process, directly expressed his desire to accept the Allied terms of surrender. He recorded a radio address that would be broadcast to the Japanese people. It was the first time most Japanese people had ever heard their emperor's voice. He told them that the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He used careful, formal language. He did not use the word surrender, but his meaning was clear. The war was over. On August 15th, 1945, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice telling them that the fighting was done. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the American battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed a formal instrument of surrender. The documents were signed on a table covered with a simple green cloth. General Douglas MacArthur presided. The ceremony was brief and formal, and with the signing of those documents, the Second World War was officially over. The war had lasted 6 years. It had killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, depending on which estimates you use. It had reshaped the map of the world. It had changed the nature of warfare, of politics, of international relations. And it had ended with a weapon that raised questions human civilization had never had to face before. Questions about what power meant. Questions about what responsibility meant. Questions about what it meant to be capable of destroying yourself. And then the debate began. The debate that has never truly ended. The debate that continues to this day, in classrooms and history books and political debates and quiet private conversations. Was it the right decision? Was dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki morally justified? Did it save more lives than it took? Or was it a crime against humanity that no military or political justification can excuse? These questions do not have simple answers. They never have. And the people who have wrestled with them, from the moment a mushroom cloud rose over Hiroshima to the present day, have come to very different conclusions. Those who defend the decision begin with the numbers. The planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, was projected to cost an enormous number of lives. American military planners estimated American casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates went higher. Japanese casualties, both military and civilian, were projected to be in the millions. The Japanese military was preparing the entire civilian population to resist. Women were being trained with bamboo spears. Children were being prepared to carry explosives toward enemy soldiers. The human cost of that invasion was projected to be catastrophic beyond anything that had happened in the war so far. The defenders of the decision also point to the ongoing suffering of the war itself. Every day the war continued. People died. The firebombing campaigns over Japan were already killing tens of thousands of people. The fighting in the Pacific was consuming lives at a terrible rate. The atomic bomb ended the war in days. If ending the war in days rather than months or years saved hundreds of thousands or millions of lives, then perhaps the terrible cost of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was, in some dark and painful calculation, worth it. This was Truman's own argument. He maintained it for the rest of his life. He said he never lost a night's sleep over the decision. Many historians believe that was not entirely true, but he never publicly wavered. He defended it to the end. The defenders also point to the nature of the Japanese military leadership at the time. Even after Hiroshima, even after Nagasaki, even after the Soviet declaration of war, there were powerful figures within the Japanese military who wanted to continue fighting. There was a failed coup attempt by young military officers who wanted to prevent the emperor's surrender message from being broadcast. The will to fight to the last existed at very high levels of the Japanese military establishment, something of enormous shock, and power was required to break through that will. The atomic bomb provided that shock. But those who challenge the decision raise powerful points of their own. They begin with the nature of the weapon itself. An atomic bomb does not distinguish between soldiers and civilians. It does not target military installations and leave hospitals standing. It kills everything within its range indiscriminately. The overwhelming majority of the people killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not soldiers. They were ordinary people going about their lives. To deliberately target a civilian population with a weapon of mass destruction, these critics argue, is a crime regardless of the military or political calculations that led to it. There are some things that cannot be justified by the outcomes they produce. The deliberate mass killing of civilians is one of them. The critics also challenge the claim that the bomb was necessary to avoid an invasion. They point out that Japan was already in an extremely weakened state by the summer of 1945. Its navy was effectively destroyed. Its air force was reduced. Its cities were being burned from the sky. Its supply lines were being strangled by a naval blockade. Many Japanese leaders were already privately discussing the possibility of seeking a negotiated end to the war. The Soviet entry into the war against Japan may, by itself, have been enough to force a Japanese surrender. The bomb may not have been necessary at all. There is also a darker argument that some historians raise about the role of the Soviet Union. By August of 1945, the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union was already beginning to crack. The two great powers were already looking ahead to the world after the war, and they did not like what they saw in each other. The atomic bomb was a demonstration of American power directed not just at Japan, but at Stalin. It was a message. It said that America had a weapon of unprecedented destructive power and was willing to use it. Some historians argue that this factor, the desire to establish American dominance in the post-war world before the Soviet Union could assert its own power, was as important a consideration as the desire to end the war with Japan. If that is true, then the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in some sense sacrificed not just to end one war, but to open the next one. There is also the question of the warning, or rather the lack of one. The petition from the scientists had asked for a clear warning to be given to Japan before the bomb was dropped. Some advisors suggested a demonstration, a bomb dropped on an uninhabited area, a remote island, or an empty stretch of ocean, to show Japan what the weapon could do without killing large numbers of civilians. Japan could then be given the chance to surrender before the weapon was used against the city. This option was considered and rejected. The official reasons given were that a failed demonstration, if the bomb did not work properly, would strengthen Japanese resolve, and that the United States only had a small number of bombs and could not afford to use one as a demonstration. But critics argue that these reasons were insufficient justifications for the decision to drop the bomb without warning on a populated city. The Japanese perspective on these events is another layer of extraordinary complexity. In Japan, the people who lived through the atomic bombings, the survivors, are called hibakusha. This is a Japanese word that means explosion-affected people. The hibakusha carried their experience for decades, many of them living with physical illnesses caused by radiation exposure, many of them also carrying a deep psychological and social weight. For many years in Japan, there was a stigma attached to being a hibakusha. People worried that the effects of radiation might be passed on to children. Hibakushas sometimes had difficulty finding marriage partners. They were marked by what had happened to them in ways that went far beyond the physical. Some of the Hibakusha became advocates for peace and for the abolition of nuclear weapons. They traveled the world telling their stories. They described what they had seen and experienced. They spoke to world leaders and to school children. They believed that if enough people truly understood what these weapons did, the world would find the will to get rid of them. Many of them are gone now. They were very old. The youngest of them were children in 1945. Time is slowly reducing their numbers. And with each passing year, the living memory of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki grows more distant. The physical cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were rebuilt after the war. They are living, thriving cities today, but each of them maintains a memorial to what happened there. In Hiroshima, the Peace Memorial Park sits near the center of where the bomb detonated. In it stands the skeletal remains of a building that was close to the explosion, one of the very few structures in that area that was not completely destroyed. It has been preserved exactly as it was after the bombing. It is called the Atomic Bomb Dome. It stands as a permanent reminder of what happened there. Around it, the city lives and moves and breathes, surrounded by history that is not forgotten. Every year on August 6th, the people of Hiroshima gather at the Peace Memorial Park for a ceremony of remembrance. Bells are rung, names are read, lanterns are floated on the river that runs through the city. It is a ceremony of mourning and a hope, a ceremony that says, this happened and it must never happen again. The world that came after the atomic bomb was a fundamentally different world from the one that had existed before it. The most obvious difference was the beginning of the nuclear arms race. The United States had the bomb. The Soviet Union immediately began working on getting its own. In 1949, they succeeded. The two superpowers now both possess weapons capable of destroying entire cities. They began building more of them, and larger ones. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which had seemed impossibly powerful in 1945, will within a decade look almost small compared to the new weapons being developed. Thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, weapons hundreds of times more powerful than anything used in the Second World War. By the height of the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union together possessed enough nuclear warheads to destroy all human life on Earth many times over. This was the world that the decision of August 1945 helped to create. A world where the possibility of human extinction was, for the first time, a realistic and immediate concern. A world where political and military leaders had to think about every conflict, every confrontation, every crisis, with the awareness that if it went too far, if the right mistakes were made at the right moments, it could all end. Not just the war, not just the country, everything. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the closest it has ever come to nuclear war. For 13 days in October that year, the United States and the Soviet Union stood at the edge of a nuclear exchange. Soviet missiles had been placed in Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The American government demanded their removal. The Soviet government initially refused. The two sides looked at each other across that edge for 13 days. In the end, the crisis was resolved through careful, difficult, exhausting diplomacy. The missiles were removed. The world stepped back from the edge. But the edge was always there. It has never gone away. The nuclear age has produced its own culture, its own language, its own way of thinking about survival and death. It produced a generation of strategists and thinkers who develop elaborate theories about how nuclear weapons could be used or threatened or withheld in ways that would prevent war rather than start it. The idea of mutual assured destruction, the understanding that any nuclear exchange between superpowers will result in complete destruction of both sides, became the dark logic that prevented the Cold War from becoming a hot one. The bomb that ended one war created a kind of terrible peace. A peace held in place not by trust or goodwill, but by the shared certainty of mutual annihilation. Harry Truman lived until 1972. He was 88 years old when he died. He never stopped defending the decision he had made in the summer of 1945. He said repeatedly, in interviews and in his memoirs and in private conversations, that he had made a decision that he believed was right given the circumstances, and that he would make the same decision again. He was a man who had lived with enormous responsibility and had found a way to carry it, But those who knew him well sometimes noticed, in his quieter moments, that the weight of what he decided was always present. You cannot order the deaths of 100,000 people and have that disappear from your inner life entirely. Whatever he said in public, the decision was part of him until the end. Oppenheimer had a very different experience. He was celebrated after the war as a hero of science and of American victory. He was named to important advisory positions. He was listened to and respected, but he also became one of the most prominent voices for caution and restraint in the development of nuclear weapons. He opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, arguing that it represented a step beyond what was militarily necessary into a realm of pure and gratuitous destructive power. His opposition made him enemies in the military establishment and in the political world. And in 1954, during the worst years of McCarthyism, when the fear of communist influence was at its height, Oppenheimer was put on trial in a security hearing. His past political associations were used against him. His loyalty was questioned. His security clearance was revoked. He was effectively stripped of his official role and pushed to the margins of the world he had helped to create. It was one of the great injustices of the Cold War era, the humiliation of the man who had built the weapon that won the war, by the government that had asked him to build it. In 2022, more than half a century after his death, the United States government formally reversed the 1954 decision and restored Oppenheimer's security clearance. It was a symbolic act. He was long dead. It could not undo what had been done to him, but it was an acknowledgement that a wrong had been committed. And it came at a moment when his story was once again capturing public attention, reminding a new generation of the complexity and the tragedy of the man who had stood in the New Mexico desert watching his creation rise into the morning sky. The debate over the bomb continues in the academic world, where historians have been arguing about it for 80 years. The argument has shifted and evolved as new documents have been declassified, as new research has emerged, as new perspectives have been brought to the conversation. Early histories tended to accept the official American narrative largely at face value. The bomb was necessary. It ended the war. It saved lives. Later historians began to ask harder questions. They looked at the evidence more carefully. They considered the perspectives of people who had not been part of the original decision-making process. They found that the picture was more complicated than the official story suggested. Some historians now argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender before the bombs were dropped, and that the bombs were not the decisive factor in ending the war. Others argue that the Japanese government was deeply divided, and that without the shock of the atomic bombings, the factions within the military that wanted to fight on would have prevailed. Some argue that the real purpose of the bombs was political, not military. Others argue that they were purely military decisions made in the context of a brutal and desperate war. The arguments go back and forth. The evidence supports multiple interpretations. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about it. This was not a simple decision, made in a simple situation. It was a decision of overwhelming complexity, made under unimaginable pressure, with consequences that no one could fully foresee. What is not in dispute is what the bombs did to people who were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki on those 2 August mornings in 1945. The physical destruction is documented. The human suffering is documented. The names of the dead are, to whatever extent they can be, recorded. The experiences of the survivors are part of the historical record. These things are real and concrete and undeniable. Whatever argument are made about military necessity or political calculation or comparative casualties, the people who died in those cities were real people. The children who were burned alive in Hiroshima were real children. The workers who were vaporized at their factory benches in Nagasaki were real people with real lives and real families who would grieve them. The abstraction of strategy and calculation cannot fully contain the reality of what happened to them. This is perhaps why the debate continues, because it touches something very deep in the human conscience. The question of whether it is ever justified to deliberately kill large numbers of civilians in order to achieve a military or political goal is not a new question, whereas always involved the killing of civilians to some degree. But the atomic bomb raised that question in a new and sharper form, because the atomic bomb was specifically designed to kill as many people as possible in a single moment, because it could not be aimed at military targets and expected to leave civilians alone, because its very destructive power the power that made it militarily significant, was inseparable from its power to kill indiscriminately. And because, once used, it opened a door that could not be closed again. The knowledge that atomic weapons were possible, that they worked, that they could be built and delivered and detonated, was now part of the permanent record of human achievement and human capacity for destruction. Other countries would build them. The Soviet Union built them. Britain built them. France built them. China built them. India and Pakistan built them. North Korea built them. Israel is widely believed to have them, though it has never confirmed it. The club of nuclear-armed nations has grown slowly but steadily in the decades since 1945, and with each new member, the world becomes a slightly more complicated and dangerous place. There have been serious negotiations and agreements aimed at limiting and reducing nuclear weapons. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968, attempted to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to additional countries and committed the existing nuclear powers to work toward eventual disarmament. The SALT agreements and later the START treaties between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then Russia reduced the number of deployed warheads significantly from their Cold War peaks. But nuclear weapons still exist in enormous numbers. Thousands of warheads remain deployed and ready. The technology exists. The knowledge cannot be undone. The door that was open in the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1945 has never been closed. The question of what to do about nuclear weapons, how to prevent their use, how to reduce their numbers, whether complete disarmament is even possible, remains one of the central unresolved questions of our time. It is a question that every generation inherits from the one before it. It is a question that began in a very real and direct way, with a decision made in the summer of 1945 to drop atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There is something deeply sobering about looking at that moment in history and understanding that the people who made the decision were not monsters. They were not evil. They were human beings doing what human beings do, making the best decisions they could in a situation of extreme difficulty and pressure, trying to balance terrible options against each other, trying to find a way through a war that had already caused unimaginable suffering. Truman was not a cruel man. Stimson was not a cruel man. Even Oppenheimer, the man who built the bomb, was a man who spent the rest of his life wrestling with what he had done. The decision to use the atomic bomb was made by human beings who were trying to end a war, not by machines without conscience. But that does not mean the decision was right. It does not mean it was the only option available. It does not mean the suffering it caused was acceptable. It does not mean the precedent it set was a safe one. Human beings making understandable decisions in difficult circumstances can still make decisions that are profoundly wrong. History is full of such decisions, and the debate over Hiroshima and Nagasaki endures because millions of people across generations and across cultures have looked at what happened there and concluded that whatever the military calculations were, something went wrong in the moral calculation. Something was lost that cannot be entirely recovered. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, understood this more deeply than anyone. They had felt it in their own bodies. They had seen it in the faces of the dead around them. They had lived with it for decades, carrying the physical and psychological weight of something that the rest of the world could only try to understand from the outside. And when they spoke about what they wanted, when they described their hopes for the future, it was almost always the same. They did not ask for revenge. They did not ask for justice in the form of punishment. They asked for the abolition of nuclear weapons. They asked for a world in which no human being would ever have to experience what they had experienced. They asked the world to learn from what had been done to them. Whether the world is capable of learning, that lesson remains to be seen. The weapons still exist. The tensions between nuclear-armed powers continue. The risk has not disappeared. In some ways, as new nations develop nuclear capabilities and as old agreements begin to fray, the risk may be growing rather than shrinking. The world that began in the New Mexico desert in July of 1945 is still the world we live in today. We have not escaped it. We have only learned, sometimes, to manage it carefully. And so the debate continues. In university lecture halls and in government committee rooms, in the memorials of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the dead are still remembered every year, in the private thoughts of people who read history and find themselves unable to arrive at a clean and comfortable conclusion, in the conversations of people who understand that the decisions made by a small number of human beings in the summer of 1945 changed the nature of human existence in ways that are still unfolding. It is not a debate that should end. It is not a debate that we can afford to grow bored with or to set aside, because at the heart of it is a question that every generation has to answer for itself. What is power for? What do we owe to the people who stand in the path of our decisions? What does it mean to be capable of enormous destruction? What do we do with that capability? How do we live with it? The bomb was built, it was used, and then time kept moving, as time always does, carrying the consequences of that moment forward into every day that has come after it. On a quiet morning in the summer of 1945, the sky above Hiroshima became something that no sky had ever been before. And in that terrible brightness, in that impossible heat, in that silence that followed the end of everything the city had been, the modern world announced itself. It announced what it was capable of. It announced the scale of the choices that human beings now had to live with. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not choose to be part of that announcement. They were ordinary people in an ordinary morning. They were going to work. They were sending their children to school. They were doing what people everywhere do in the quiet hours before the day truly begins. And then the sky changed, and they became part of something larger than themselves, something that the whole world would have to reckon with, something that the whole world is still reckoning with. That is the story of the atomic bomb. It is not a story with a clean ending. It does not resolve into simple comfort or simple condemnation. It is a story that requires us to hold many things at once. The genuine terror of the war that produced it, the genuine suffering it caused, the genuine complexity of the decision that deployed it, the genuine uncertainty about whether history would have been better or worse without it, and the genuine responsibility that falls on every generation to understand it clearly and to take seriously the obligation it places on all of us. The decision was made, the bombs were dropped, the war ended, and the world entered a new age that it has never fully figured out how to navigate safely. We are still in that age. We are still living with that decision. We are still, in a very real sense, standing in the shadow of those 2 mornings in August 1945, trying to find our way forward into something better. The mushroom cloud that rose over Hiroshima was not just the end of the city. It was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of a question that humanity has not yet answered. A question about what we are willing to do to each other, and what we are willing to do to prevent it from happening again. That question is still waiting, still asking, still waiting for an answer that the world has not yet fully given. And maybe that is the most important thing to understand about the atomic bomb, about the decision America still debates. It is not just history. It is not something that happened and then was finished. It is an ongoing responsibility, a permanent inheritance, a weight that passes from one generation to the next, asking each of them the same thing. Now that you know what is possible, what will you choose to do? Now that you know what human beings are capable of, how will you live? How will you build the world that comes after? Those are not easy questions. They were never easy questions. They are the questions that rose with a cloud over Hiroshima on the morning of August 6th, 1945. And they are the questions that are still rising, still present, still asking every single day.